The afternoon sun poured through the high, arched windows of the city's most prestigious performing arts center, casting long golden shadows across the polished marble floor. It was the kind of place that smelled of expensive perfume, old wood, and silent judgment. The air inside was cool and perfectly conditioned, a stark contrast to the heat of the busy streets outside. This was the Hall of Echoes, a building known for grooming the world's most famous musicians. It was a place where history was made, but it was also a place where outsiders rarely felt welcome. In the center of the grand lobby stood a concert grand piano, black and shiny as a pool of oil. It was open to the public for a few hours, a rare opportunity for anyone to sit and play. Surrounding the piano were clusters of people in expensive suits and elegant dresses. They were the students of the conservatory, the elite, the ones who had been playing since they could walk. They held their sheet music like shields and their instrument cases like trophies. They spoke in hushed, superior tones about composers' techniques and upcoming recitals. Into this world walked a young woman named Elena. She did not walk with the easy confidence of the other students. She walked carefully, as if afraid her shoes might scuff the pristine floor. Elena was not from the city. She had traveled hours on a bus just to be here. She wore a simple, faded blue dress that had been mended at the hem, and a small cardigan that looked a bit too thin for the air-conditioned hall. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried no expensive leather case. She held only a few sheets of folded paper in her hand, her music, which was creased from being in her pocket. As she stepped further into the room, the hum of conversation seemed to dip. It wasn't a silence exactly, but a shift in the air. Eyes turned toward her. In a room full of peacocks, she looked like a sparrow. The students near the entrance stopped talking and glanced at her clothes, then at her face, and then quickly away, dismissing her as someone who was clearly lost. Maybe they thought she was a tourist looking for a bathroom, or a student from the public school nearby who had wandered in by mistake. Elena felt their eyes on her, burning into her back. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous thump against her ribs. She gripped her folded music tighter. She knew she didn't look like she belonged. She knew her shoes were worn and her bag was cheap, but she also knew why she was here. She had saved every penny from her part-time job at a bakery just to afford the bus ticket and the entrance fee. She had practiced on an old, out-of-tune piano in her church basement for years, dreaming of a moment like this. She wasn't here to impress them with her clothes. She was here to touch the keys of a real concert grand piano. She took a deep breath and kept walking. Her eyes were fixed on the piano in the distance. It looked magnificent. It sat on a small stage, bathed in the spotlight from the window. To her, it wasn't just furniture. It was a beast waiting to be tamed, a machine full of magic. But the path to that stage was blocked by a wall of people. To her left, a group of young men stood with their arms crossed, watching the current pianist. A student in a tuxedo who was playing something fast and complicated. They nodded their heads appreciatively, pointing out technicalities to each other. As Elena passed them, one of them, a tall young man with perfectly gelled hair, turned his gaze toward her. He looked her up and down, a smirk playing on the corner of his mouth. He leaned in to whisper something to his friend, and they both chuckled softly. The sound was like a needle scratching on a record. Elena's cheeks grew hot, but she refused to look down. She kept her head up and walked past them. On her right, a group of young women sat on velvet benches, adjusting their gloves and checking their reflections in compact mirrors. When Elena walked by, one of them wrinkled her nose slightly, as if she smelled something unpleasant. She turned her back to Elena, effectively shutting her out of their circle. It was a gesture so small yet so cruel. It screamed, "You are not one of us." Elena reached the center of the room, near the piano. The student who was playing finished with a dramatic flourish, and the small crowd around him clapped politely. He stood up, taking a bow, looking very pleased with himself. Elena waited for him to step away. She looked at the bench. It was empty. This was her chance. She stepped up onto the small platform. The floorboards creaked softly under her worn shoes. To her, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. She could feel the weight of the entire room shift. The people who had been ignoring her were now watching her. They were waiting. They wanted to see what this girl in the faded dress, thought she was doing. Elena sat down on the bench. It was plush and firm, much more comfortable than the wooden bench at her church. She placed her folded papers on the music stand, smoothing them out with trembling hands. The piano loomed in front of her, huge and black. The keys were white ivory, pristine and inviting. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The staring eyes, the smirks, the expensive clothes, it all faded away. There was only her and the music, but the moment was fragile. As she adjusted the bench, the silence of the room was broken by a loud, scoffing laugh. It came from the tall young man with the gelled hair. He hadn't walked away. He had moved closer, standing with his friends just a few feet from the piano. He wasn't trying to be quiet. He wanted her to hear him. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the space. "Is this a joke?" Elena froze. Her hands hovered over the keys. She didn't turn around. She hoped, desperately, that he was talking to someone else. "I think she's lost," another voice chimed in. This one was from a girl standing near the pillars. "This isn't the tourist attraction, darling." A few more giggles rippled through the crowd. It wasn't everyone, most people were just watching curiously, but the bullies were loud enough to poison the air. The confidence Elena had built up over the long bus ride began to crack. She felt small again. She felt like the baker's daughter with the holes in her shoes. The tall young man took a step closer to the edge of the stage. He crossed his arms, looking down at her with a mixture of amusement and arrogance. He was used to being the best player in the room. He was used to people fearing his talent. Seeing someone like Elena, someone so ordinary, daring to sit at the same instrument he played, was an insult to him. "Do you even know how to read that?" he asked, nodding at her crumpled sheet music. "Or are you just going to bang on the keys like a toddler?" His friends laughed again. It was a mean sound, the laugh of people who have never been told no. "You're blocking the view for people who can actually play," another student added. Elena's fingers curled into fists on her lap. She could feel the tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She wanted to run. She wanted to grab her music, run out the heavy double doors, and get on the first bus back home. It would be so easy. Nobody here wanted her to play. They had already decided she was a waste of time. She looked at the keys. They were so white, so perfect. She thought about her church piano, where the C# key stuck half the time and the pedals squeaked. She thought about the long nights after her shift at the bakery, when her hands were covered in flour and she was too tired to stand. But she would sit and play until her neighbors banged on the walls, not to complain, but to ask for more. She loved music more than she feared their laughter. That was the secret she kept hidden in her chest. Elena took a slow, shaky breath. She didn't turn around to face the tall boy. She didn't try to argue with him. She knew that words weren't her weapon. Her fingers were. She had poured her life, her pain, and her joy into this music. It was the only thing she had that was truly hers. "Let's give her some space," a woman's voice said from the back of the room. It was an older woman, a teacher perhaps, but her voice was tired and lacked the command to stop the bullies. "Oh, come on, this is funny," the tall boy insisted. "Look at her. She's shaking. She's going to fall off the bench." Elena wasn't shaking because she was weak. She was shaking because she was gathering her energy. She was like a storm cloud building up on the horizon. She pulled her feet closer to the pedals, testing the resistance. They were heavy and responsive, perfect. The room grew quieter, but not out of respect. It was the silence of a crowd waiting for a car crash. They were expecting a mess. They were expecting a few wrong notes, a fumble, and a quick retreat. They wanted their prejudice confirmed. They wanted to believe that talent was something you bought with expensive lessons and designer clothes, not something you earned through sweat and tears. The tall boy leaned in, hovering right over her shoulder. He could smell the stale bus smell on her clothes, or maybe he just imagined it. "Go on," he whispered, close to her ear. "Play us a lullaby. I could use a nap." His friend snickered. Elena closed her eyes. She blocked them out. She blocked out the marble floor, the chandeliers, and the judgment. She imagined she was back in the dusty basement, alone with the sounds in her head. She saw the notes not as black dots on a page, but as colors, as waves, as voices needing to be heard. She raised her hands. The sleeves of her cardigan slipped back slightly, revealing her wrists. They were thin, but the muscles in her fingers were strong. Developed from years of pressing down stubborn keys. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. It was the calm before the execution. Everyone held their breath. The bully's H. The sound of that first powerful chord seemed to suck the air right out of the room. For a split second, nobody moved. The tall boy, who had been leaning over her with a smirk plastered on his face, actually flinched. He took a sharp step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes. It was a small victory, just a physical reaction to a loud noise, but to Elena it felt huge. The vibration of the piano strings hummed through the floorboards and up into her legs, waking up a fire inside her that had been dormant for too long, but the silence didn't last long. The tall boy quickly recovered his balance, and his face twisted from surprise back into annoyance. He smoothed the front of his jacket, trying to look unimpressed. He looked at his friends and rolled his eyes, as if to say, "Okay, she can hit a key." "So what? Loud," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "But being loud isn't the same as being good, sweetheart. That was just noise. Anyone can bang on the keys." His friends chuckled nervously, agreeing with him because that was what they were trained to do. They were a pack, and he was the leader. If he said it was noise, then it was noise. Elena didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the keys. Her hands were hovering, ready to continue. She knew they were waiting for her to mess up. They wanted her to play a simple melody, maybe "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," so they could laugh and tell her to get off the stage. But she couldn't play that. Her fingers didn't know how to play simple anymore. They only knew how to speak the truth. The tall boy wasn't done. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage again, emboldened by the fact that Elena hadn't started playing yet. He crossed his arms and puffed out his chest. He wanted the attention back on him. He was the prodigy here, not her. "Let's make this interesting," he announced to the room, raising his voice so the people in the back could hear. "I bet she doesn't even know how to read that paper she brought. It's probably a grocery list." A few polite laughs from the crowd. They were uncomfortable, but they wouldn't dare stand up to him. "If you're going to waste our time," the boy continued, looking down at Elena's bent head, "then play something real. Do you know anything by insert difficult composer? Or is that too advanced for your little lessons?" He named a piece that was infamous among piano students. It was fast, complicated, and required a level of technical skill that took years to master. It was the kind of piece professors used to weed out the weak students. He said it just to mock her, thinking that a girl in a mended dress would have never even heard of it, let alone practiced it. "Play the Devil's Etude," he challenged, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Just the first page. If you can get through 10 lines without stopping, I'll shut up. But I don't think you can even find the starting note." Elena's fingers twitched. She knew that piece. Oh, she knew it. She knew it better than she knew the back of her own hand. She had spent 2 years struggling with it on her old, battered piano at home. She had cried over that piece. She had bled over that piece, literally, when a splinter from her piano key dug into her thumb. It was a monster of a song, full of jumps and runs that terrified most players. But to Elena, it wasn't a test. It was a friend. She slowly lifted her hands from her lap. The room was watching her now, waiting for her to apologize and walk away. That's what a normal person would do. That's what a polite person would do. But Elena wasn't interested in being polite anymore. She was interested in being heard. Without saying a word, she shifted her position on the bench. She adjusted the pedal with her foot, testing it. The action was smooth and silent. She cracked her knuckles softly, a habit she couldn't break. It was the only sound in the vast hall. The tall boy raised an eyebrow. "So, are you deaf? I told you what to play?" Elena closed her eyes for a brief second and visualized the music. She saw the notes dancing in her mind. She felt the rhythm in her chest. Then she opened her eyes, and they were different. They weren't the eyes of a scared girl anymore. They were sharp, focused, and intense. She looked at the keys not as an enemy, but as a tool she had mastered. She placed her left hand on the low notes and her right hand high up on the keyboard. The stretch was wide, almost too wide for small hands, but she held it steady. And then she began. It started slow, a series of dark, moody chords that echoed through the hall like footsteps in a cavern. It wasn't the flashy part yet, but it was heavy. The tone she produced was incredibly rich and warm like velvet. The sound quality was so professional that the smirks on the faces of the students nearby faltered just a little. They knew tone. You couldn't buy tone like that. You had to earn it. The tall boy tilted his head. He crossed his arms tighter, waiting for the hard part. Okay, decent start, he muttered, though he sounded less sure of himself. Now, let's see you handle the jumps. Elena knew exactly where the difficulty began. She took a breath, and her right hand launched into a blur of motion. Suddenly, the room was filled with a cascade of notes flowing like a river of water. It was incredibly fast. Her fingers moved independently, striking the keys with a precision that was scary. The change in the atmosphere was instant. The people who were just a minute ago whispering about her clothes stopped whispering entirely. Their eyes were drawn to her hands. They were mesmerizing. Her hands didn't look like the delicate, carefully manicured hands of the other students. They looked strong. The tendons moved visibly under her skin as she stretched for octaves, her fingers flying across the ivory like they had wings. The tall boy leaned forward, his nose inches from the fallboard of the piano. He was squinting, his eyes darting back and forth between her hands and the keys. He was looking for the mistake. He was waiting for the fumble. He was convinced that at any second her fingers would get tangled, and the music would crash, but the crash never came. She hit the first major, jump a leap of more than an octave and landed perfectly. The note rang out, clear as a bell. Then she did it again, and again. It was a dangerous, acrobatic section of the song that terrified even experienced players. One slip, one miss of the thumb, and the whole piece would fall apart. Elena didn't miss. She didn't even hesitate. She attacked the piano. There was a raw aggression in her playing that these students had never seen before. They were taught to play pretty, to play safe, to make everything sound polite. Elena played like she was fighting a war. Every note had a purpose. Every phrase had emotion. A bead of sweat rolled down the tall boy's temple. He stopped looking at his friends. He stopped looking at the girl. He looked only at the music. His brain was struggling to process what he was hearing. This wasn't just good for a girl like her. This was good. Period. It was better than he could play it, and he knew it. The realization hit him in the stomach like a heavy stone. The mocking grin was gone, replaced by a look of confusion and dawning horror. The crowd began to shift. People who were standing near the back started walking toward the stage, drawn in by the magnetism of the performance. The security guard near the door put down his radio and looked up. A janitor pausing with his mop stopped to listen. The music was taking over the room. It was demanding respect. Elena didn't notice any of this. She was in her own world now. The old piano at the church, the smell of bread dough from the bakery, the long bus ride, it all fueled her. She poured her hunger, her loneliness, and her grit into the keys. The piano was singing for her, screaming for her. She entered the middle section of the piece, where the melody switched to the left hand while the right hand did rapid, delicate trills high up. It was a nightmare of coordination. Her left hand pounded out the bass line, heavy and authoritative, while her right hand shimmered above it like light on water. The students in the front row exchanged wide-eyed glances. They knew this song. They knew how hard this part was. They had all failed it at some point. And here was this stranger, this nobody, playing it with a precision that made it look easy. One of the girls who had been laughing earlier opened her mouth slightly, her compact mirror forgotten in her hand. She looked at the tall boy, then back at Elena. The mockery had evaporated. Now there was only awe. The tall boy stood frozen. His face was pale. He wanted to say something, to make a joke, to interrupt and stop this humiliation, but he couldn't. The music was too strong. It was a wall of sound that he couldn't break through. He realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that he had made a terrible mistake. He had woken a sleeping giant. He had challenged a master, and now he had to stand there and listen to his own defeat. Note by perfect note, Elena's pace quickened. She was approaching the climax of the piece, the hardest part. The room was holding its collective breath. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a test. And she was about to pass it with flying colors. The tempo kicked up a notch. It wasn't just fast now. It was dangerous. Elena's fingers were moving so quickly that they looked like they were vibrating. This was the part of the music where most people tripped up. It was a long, dizzying run of notes that went up and down the keyboard like a roller coaster. One wrong timing, one split second of hesitation, and the whole spell would break. The music would stumble, and the bullies would win. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't even blink. Her eyes were locked on her hands, but her mind was seeing the colors of the music. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. She had practiced this specific section 1,000 times in the dark, cold basement of her church. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply to each key to make it sing. She knew exactly how to lift her wrist to let her fingers fly. The sound coming from the piano was changing. It started deep and heavy, but now it was rising, climbing higher and higher. It sounded like a storm approaching. The low notes rumbled like thunder, and the high notes were like lightning strikes. The volume grew. It wasn't just loud. It was intense. The air in the hall seemed to vibrate against everyone's skin. The tall boy stood rooted to the spot. His arms had dropped to his sides. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't looking at his friends to see if they were laughing. He was staring at Elena's hands with a look of pure disbelief. He knew this piece. He had studied it for months with his private tutor, and he still couldn't play it at this speed. He struggled to keep the rhythm steady, but Elena wasn't struggling. She was conquering it. He looked at her face. She wasn't smiling. She looked serious, almost fierce. A bead of sweat had rolled down her forehead and was hanging from her eyebrow. She didn't wipe it away. She was too focused. He saw the muscles in her arms flexing as she reached for the far ends of the keyboard. She was using her whole body to play, putting her soul into every note. It was raw. It was messy in a beautiful way. It was the opposite of the polished, boring playing he was used to hearing in this hall. "She's actually doing it," one of the girls whispered from the front row. Her voice was shaky. The tall boy heard her. He gritted his teeth. He didn't want to believe it. He wanted to find a flaw. He wanted to see her stumble. He watched her left hand, waiting for it to miss a jump. But her hand landed perfectly on the bass note, booming out a sound that shook the floor. Then her right hand swept up the keys, a waterfall of sound that was perfectly smooth. It was technically perfect. But it was more than that. It had emotion. It sounded angry and sad and hopeful all at the same time. It sounded like a person who had been ignored for too long and was finally screaming to be heard. The crowd, which had been scattered around the room, was now pressing in toward the stage. People had stopped checking their watches. They had stopped whispering. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't the polite silence from before. This was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people who were witnessing something special. They were afraid to breathe, afraid that even the sound of their own breath might break the magic. Even the older teachers, the ones who usually stood in the back with their arms crossed, judging every note, had stepped forward. One elderly man, who had taught at the conservatory for 40 years, adjusted his glasses. He leaned in, squinting at the girl's hands. He had heard thousands of students play this piano. He could hear the difference between a student who practiced because their parents made them and a student who practiced because they had no choice. Elena was the latter. She played like her life depended on it. Elena felt a change in the room. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them. She could feel the energy shifting from hostile to amazed. It gave her a rush. Her heart was hammering in her chest, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from power. For so long, she had been the quiet one, the one in the background, the one people looked through. Today, right here, she was the center of the universe. And it felt incredible. She pushed the tempo even faster. The music was racing now. Her fingers were flying across the keys, a blur of motion. The sound was overwhelming. It filled every corner of the huge lobby. It bounced off the marble walls and the high ceiling. It was a physical force that you could feel in your chest. The tall boy felt like the air was being knocked out of him. He remembered how he had laughed at her. He remembered his cruel jokes about her clothes and her toddler hands. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He looked around and saw that everyone was mesmerized. No one was looking at him. No one cared about his expensive suit or his perfect hair. All eyes were on the girl in the faded dress. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead he had given her the stage. He had challenged her, and she was destroying him. "She's going too fast," one of his friends muttered, sounding panicked. "She's going to crash." But Elena didn't crash. She took a sharp turn in the music, switching from the fast runs to heavy, crashing chords. Boom, boom, the piano seemed to roar. She hit the keys with such force that the piano rocked slightly on its wheels. It was aggressive. It was wild. This was the part of the story where the heroine fights back. The music was her sword, and she was swinging it with everything she had. Every time she struck a chord, it felt like she was striking back at the doubts, the mocking whispers, and the years of being told she wasn't good enough. Her breathing became heavy. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm. She was getting tired, her hands were starting to ache, but she didn't slow down. She used that pain. She poured it into the sound, making the music even louder, even more intense. She was running on pure adrenaline now. The audience was captivated. A young student, no older than 10, stood clutching his violin case, his eyes wide as saucers. He had never seen anyone play with so much passion. He didn't care about the technique or the difficulty. He just knew that it sounded like a story. It sounded like a dragon flying over a mountain. Elena's fingers were starting to feel hot. The friction of hitting the keys so fast was warming them up. She could feel the calluses on her fingertips, tough and hard from years of work. She didn't have the soft hands of the other students, and she was glad. Her hands were tools. They were strong. They knew how to work. She approached the final chaotic climb of the piece. This was it. The climax. The notes were getting higher and higher, climbing the scale, getting faster and faster. The tension in the room was tight as a violin string. Everyone leaned forward. The tall boy stopped breathing. He knew what was coming. If she nailed this ending, she would be a legend in this room. If she missed, she would fall, but Elena didn't miss. She launched into the final ascent, a blur of white and black keys, her hands crossing over each other, dancing a dangerous dance. The volume swelled to a deafening roar. The sound filled the hall, shaking the windows, rattling the sheet music on the stands. She wasn't just playing a song anymore. She was creating a moment that none of these people, with all their money and privilege, would ever forget. And as she hit the highest note of the run, holding it with a trembling hand before bringing it crashing down into the final resolution, the tall boy finally lowered his head. He couldn't watch anymore. He knew he had lost. The music shifted gears. Suddenly, the chaotic speed softened into a melody that was hauntingly beautiful. It was like the storm had passed, leaving only the sound of rain on a window. Elena's hands, which had been moving so fast they were a blur, slowed down. She began to play a series of deep, sorrowful chords in the left hand while the right hand played a single, crying line high up on the keyboard. The change in the room was physical. For the last few minutes, the audience had been tense, amazed by the speed and the noise. But now they were moved. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy with emotion. People who had been smirking, whispering, or checking their phones were now perfectly still. The girl who had been holding the compact mirror had completely forgotten about it. Her hand was frozen in midair, her eyes locked on Elena. Elena poured her heart into this part of the song. This wasn't about showing off how fast her fingers could move. This was the part where she told her story without speaking a single word. She thought about the early mornings practicing before school. She thought about the times she had been told to give up, to get a real job, to stop dreaming. She let all that loneliness flow out of her and into the piano. The sound was so pure, so sad, and so honest that it felt like she was reaching inside everyone's chest, and touching their heart. The tall boy stood like a statue. His face had lost all color. He was staring at Elena, but he wasn't seeing the girl in the mended dress anymore. He was seeing a master at work. He knew this song. He had played it in recitals before. But when he played it, it sounded like a math problem. It was correct, but it was empty. Hearing Elena play, it was like hearing the song for the first time. She was finding colors in the melody that he didn't know existed. He realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that he played with his brain, but she played with her soul. He looked down at his own hands. He looked at his manicured nails and his soft palms. For the first time he felt a deep sense of shame. He remembered his cruel words, his laughter, and his arrogance. He had judged her based on her clothes and her background. He thought that because he had money and lessons, he owned the music. But standing there, listening to the heartbreaking beauty coming from the piano, he understood that he owned nothing. Music wasn't about status. It was about truth. And right now, Elena was the truth. The crowd grew. People who had been walking by in the hallway outside couldn't help but stop. They poked their heads in through the open doors, drawn by the sound. A mother with a young child stopped walking and put her hand over the child's mouth, gently shushing them. Security guards, who usually stood stiffly against the walls, relaxed their posture and leaned in to listen. The music had created a gravity well and everyone was being pulled in. Elena's fingers were starting to ache. The intense exertion of the past few minutes was taking its toll. Her forearms burned and her breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. But she didn't stop. She pushed through the pain. It felt like the music was playing her now, not the other way around. She was just the vessel. She transitioned back into the fast, aggressive section. The sad melody was gone, replaced by a fiery, angry energy. She hit the keys with authority. The piano thundered. The sound was huge, filling the massive space of the hall. It bounced off the high ceilings and echoed back, layer upon layer of sound. This was the moment when the arrogance of the room completely shattered. The students who had looked down on her were now looking up to her literally and figuratively. They realized they were witnessing something rare. You could go to 100 recitals and see students play the right notes. But once in a lifetime, you saw someone who transcended the instrument. Someone who made the piano disappear so that only the music remained. The tall boy's friends, the ones who had chuckled along with him, were now looking at each other with awkward expressions. They didn't know what to do. They felt stupid. They realized that their behavior had been petty and small. They watched Elena with a mix of envy and respect. They saw the sweat dripping down her face, the way her whole body moved with the rhythm, the raw power she possessed. They knew, without a doubt, that they could not do what she was doing. Not even close. An older man in a gray suit, who looked like a professor or a judge, stepped out from the back of the crowd. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, a sign of deep respect. He had a stern face, the kind of face that rarely smiled. But as he listened to Elena, his eyes softened. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over him. He was a man who had heard everything, from orchestras to soloists, but this performance touched him. It reminded him of why he fell in love with music in the first place. Before the rules and the schools got in the way, Elena was lost in the sound. She didn't know that the professor was there. She didn't know that the bullies were standing with their heads bowed. She only knew the music. She felt the vibrations of the strings through the bench running up her spine. She felt the weight of the hammers striking the strings. She was in complete control. She began the final climb of the song. The notes got higher and higher, building tension like a rocket about to launch. Her left hand was playing a driving rhythm, pushing the song forward, while her right hand was reaching for the sky. The volume increased. The sound filled every corner of the room. It was deafening, but nobody covered their ears. They wanted to drown in it. The tall boy felt his heart pounding in his chest, thumping in time with the bass notes. He was scared for her. It was so fast, so intense. He was terrified she would make a mistake and ruin it. But he was even more terrified that she wouldn't. If she pulled this off, if she nailed this ending, she would prove everything he believed about himself wrong. She would show him that talent is something you are born with and fight for, not something you buy. Elena's fingers were flying. They were a blur of motion. The air around the piano seemed to shimmer with the energy she was creating. The room was no longer a cold, judgmental hall. It was alive. It was vibrating. The audience wasn't bored anymore. They were on the edge of their seats, breathless, terrified, and exhilarated all at once. She hit a series of chromatic runs that defied logic. Her hands crossed over each other, dancing up and down the keys, weaving a complex tapestry of sound. It was the hardest part of the piece. It was the part where even the best players sometimes stumbled, but Elena didn't stumble. She attacked the keys. She commanded them. She was a warrior, and the piano was her weapon. She was fighting for her dignity, her respect, and her place in this world. The sound grew to a fever pitch. It was a roar. It was a wave crashing against a cliff. It was the sound of 1,000 emotions being released all at once. The audience stopped breathing. The tall boy squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch, overwhelmed by the sheer power of the music. The teacher in the back opened his eyes wide, his jaw dropping slightly. Elena reached for the final chord. She lifted her hands high above her head, her body tense, every muscle ready to strike. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment the silence would break and the judgment would fall. Elena's hands came down like a judge's gavel. She didn't just press the keys. She slammed into them with every ounce of strength she had left. The final chord exploded from the piano, a massive, earth-shaking sound that seemed to lift the ceiling of the grand hall. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical wall of sound that hit everyone in the chest. The heavy brass strings inside the instrument vibrated violently, singing with a power that lingered in the air long after the impact, for 3 heartbeats. Elena held her hands frozen on the keys, pressing them deep into the ivories. Her body was rigid, her head bowed, her chest heaving. She was squeezing the very last drop of vibration out of the instrument, letting the sound ring out into the far corners of the room. Then she lifted her hands. She pulled them away from the keyboard and let them drop into her lap. She lifted her foot off the sustain pedal, severing the connection. Silence. But this wasn't the cold, empty silence from when she first walked in. This was a heavy, thunderous silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when something incredible occurs, and the human brain needs a few seconds to process it. The air in the room felt charged, like the static after a lightning strike. The sound of the piano was still echoing in everyone's ears, ghost notes floating in the air. Elena sat there, staring at her knees. Her hands were trembling violently now. The adrenaline that had kept her going was quickly fading, leaving her feeling weak and lightheaded. She could hear her own ragged breathing, loud in the quietness. She was terrified. She didn't know what was happening behind her back. Were they angry? Were they laughing? Had she made a fool of herself after all? She waited for the mockery. She waited for the tall boy to make a sarcastic comment about her temper tantrum on the keys. She waited for the polite, pitying clapping that you give to a child who tries but fails, but no one spoke. No one laughed. No one moved. Slowly, shakily, Elena turned around on the bench to face the room. What she saw made her gasp. The entire crowd was pressed forward, right up to the edge of the stage. Their faces were blank, their mouths slightly open. They looked like they had seen a ghost, but in a good way. The tall boy was standing right where she had left him, but he wasn't smirking. His arms were hanging loose at his sides, and his face was pale. He was looking at her with a mixture of shock and complete awe. Then the dam broke. It started with the older man in the gray suit, the teacher who had been standing in the back. He didn't just clap. He slammed his hands together, a loud, sharp sound. He took a step forward and began to clap rhythmically. Bravo! Bravo! The sound sparked a chain reaction. The young mother with the child started clapping, her eyes shining with tears. The security guard nodded his head and clapped his gloved hands together. The students, the ones who had mocked her, looked at each other for a split second, and then they joined in. It wasn't a reluctant clap. It was genuine. Suddenly the whole hall erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. People were cheering. Someone whistled loudly. The tall boy's friends were clapping so hard their palms must have been stinging. The noise washed over Elena like a warm wave. It was deafening, chaotic, and wonderful. The tall boy stood still for a moment, looking at the floor. He felt a lump in his throat. He realized he had been a fool. He had judged a book by its cover, and he had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. He looked up at Elena, who was still sitting on the bench. Looking small and overwhelmed, slowly, he raised his hands and began to clap. He clapped harder than anyone else. He looked her right in the eye and gave her a small, respectful nod. It was an apology. It was a surrender. He was acknowledging that she was better than him, and he was okay with that because the music was worth it. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't help it. One tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of her cardigan. She couldn't believe it. They weren't laughing. They were cheering. For her dot, she stood up. Her legs felt like jelly, but she managed to stand. She didn't bow like a fancy princess. She just gave a shy, awkward little nod to the room. She offered a small, trembling smile. It was a smile of relief, of joy, and of victory. The applause grew even louder. The man in the gray suit shouted, "Encore! Play another." Elena shook her head gently. She didn't have another song in her. She had given everything she had to that one performance. She didn't have any energy left. She leaned down and picked up her folded, crumpled sheet music from the stand. She held it against her chest like a shield. She walked toward the edge of the stage. The crowd parted to let her through, just like the Red Sea. As she stepped down, the students moved back, giving her space. They didn't look at her with pity anymore. They looked at her with reverence. They saw her worn shoes and her mended dress, but now they saw a master musician wearing them. The tall boy stepped aside as she passed. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the floor, then looked back at her, his eyes full of respect. He didn't try to stop her to introduce himself. He didn't try to take credit. He just let her walk. Elena walked through the lobby, the sound of the applause still ringing behind her. As she reached the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall, she glanced back one last time. The grand piano sat on the stage, looking innocent and quiet, but she knew it wasn't quiet anymore. She had woken it up. She had given it a voice for a few brief minutes. She pushed the doors open and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The city noise, cars honking, people talking rushed to meet her. But it didn't bother her today. The world felt different. The colors seemed brighter. The air smelled sweeter. She walked toward the bus stop, her heart still beating fast. She knew she had a long journey home. She knew she would have to go back to work at the bakery tomorrow. She knew her life hadn't magically changed into a fairy tale. She didn't have a record deal, and she wasn't famous, but she had something better. She had the memory of this moment. She had the feeling of the keys under her fingers and the sound of the applause in her ears. She knew now that her talent was real. She didn't need their approval to be good, but it sure felt nice to have it. She climbed onto the bus, digging into her pocket for her pass. She sat in a seat near the window, clutching her folded music to her chest. As the bus pulled away from the curb, moving away from the fancy performing arts center, Elena leaned her head against the glass and closed her eyes. A small smile played on her lips. They had mocked her. They had underestimated her. But she had shown them. And in doing so, she had shown herself that she belonged anywhere she wanted to be. The piano didn't care about her clothes. The music didn't care about her bank account. It only cared about her heart. And today, her heart had sung louder than anything else in the room.